So game 7 of the World Championship match between Magnus Carlsen and Nepomniachtchi. Not quite the fireworks of game 6. I think Nepo wanted a simple game, so he played e4 as he has done throughout and went into the Roy Lopez as we have seen. Magnus once more repeated his rook b8 idea, which he struggled with in the previous game, but I'm sure that he and his team had prepared some more ideas in this line. So in this game, Nepo went for AB, take, and H3 as we have seen before, but in this position not C3 like he played in the previous game, but D3 this time. And it's not sure why he did not go for C3. Maybe he suspected that Magnus and his team have prepared some improvements over the previous game. Or maybe he just wanted a safe game and he does not want to show his preparations with C3 in game 7 because he's already pretty tired from game 6. So he's probably wanting to just get game 7 out of the way and get some rest and show some fresh ideas later in the match. So he played safer with d3. Magnus now played h6, so he's preventing a future knight g5 because he wants to get his rook to e8 and drop his bishop to f8. And as we have seen, when we get the rook to e8, the f7 pawn can often be weak and knight g5 can immediately target that. So h6 to stop those ideas. Now knight c3 from Nepo, rook e8, knight d5. And knight takes d5 is obviously the first move that comes to mind, but here bishop takes d5 is quite reasonable, but e takes d5 is more critical because this knight has to go to d4. That's the only square. After takes and takes, the engines may say this is completely equal for black, but from a human perspective, it is black who has to play defensively because he's already got a weakness on b5. And this weakness on d4 is not yet defended. The bishop would have to come here to spend a move to defend that guy. So overall, maybe black can hold this, but white is the one who will be pressing. And as we saw from game 6, when that happens, the defender over the course of time has a good chance of crumbling. Plus, white has the open a file, who could come down to a7, could hit c7. So there's a lot of hidden problems in the position that the engine evaluation doesn't tell you about. So Magnus smartly refused that and simply dropped his bishop back to f8, saying, what do you have with knight d5? I don't see anything. And now if he plays a move, let's say like pawn to c3, then he could take on d5, and after ed, he does not have to go to d4. In this case, he cannot, but he has c7 or e7 vacated for his knight to move there. So that's available now that bishops drop back to f8. Okay, so knight takes f6 from Nepo. So this is a little bit of surprise because he's wasted 3 moves, 1, 2, 3, to take out a knight on the king side, which was not as strong as this knight potentially could be with knight d2, knight f1, knight e3, knight f5 later sometime. So it's unclear what Nepo thinks is white's achievement from this trade, but maybe it could just maybe be the case that trading that knight makes it more difficult for black himself to get d5 in the position, and then Nepo can play slowly for c3 and d4 himself. So maybe that's the idea with swapping off this knight with that knight to prevent d5 and get c3 d4 himself. So let's see. So he takes, and now he does try for c3 and d4, as we can see. But Magnus says no problems. I can bring this knight back here and reroute it to g6 and start looking at your king side. This is slightly weak. So bishop e3 first, and now there's a threat in the position, because if knight g6, then bishop a7, and the rook is a goner. Because if rook b7, then bishop d5, and he is indeed lost. So bishop e3 is a good way of stopping knight g6, because black has to deal with this guy first. So black says, no problem, I can play bishop to e6, and I can nullify your light squared bishop here. And once that happens, there's my rook is far safer. Plus now the rooks are connected, so the rook could come down to a8 to challenge this rook on the a file as well. So bishop e6 overall a very reasonable move. Nepo went ahead with his plan of playing d4, and you can hardly fault him for that. There was another interesting idea in this position, which is rook to a6, trying to control the a file. So for example, if rook a8, then look at this, queen a1 trades, and you may say, well, isn't this lost? But queen takes b5 hits this bishop, hits that rook, and actually wins the game. So black would have to play bishop takes h3, because if gh, then this guy on f3 is dropping. So instead, white would play queen takes b5, and it's a materially equal position, but quite an imbalanced position. So this was another interesting way of playing this position. But Jan went for d4. And now let's imagine that black is careless, and after e takes and c takes, he plays a move like rook to a8, just to show what white's idea is. The idea is to play d5, push this guy back. Well, first of all, you could take, so that your queen's not distracted from the d1 square. Then play d5, bishop d7, and knight d4. And now you can see that this knight is extremely well placed, and that pawn on c7 is soon going to be a target on this c file, as white's pieces come down this way to attack him. So that's the idea with these two pawns in the center, to push d5 and really start to pressure c7. But Magnus is too good for that. I should mention that here bishop takes d4 is another move, and knight takes, but they're not anything special. Bishop takes d4, just queen g6, and this queen is quite safe. And if knight takes d4, then you can take here, and it's a different type of position than the one that happened in the game, and definitely not problematic for black. But c takes d4, because Jan has now the open c file to hit this guy, so he's got a concrete plan. Bishop takes b3 from Magnus, takes, and now he plays knight g6, threatening the pawn on e4. And that's his way of solving the problem of this pawn on c7. Because if, let's say, white tries to hold this pawn with a move, let's say make a move like queen d3, black can simply play c5, defended by this bishop on f8, there's dc, and it holds it, and black has solved his problem of his queenside pawn. And that is true regardless of how white chooses to hold this pawn, whether with bishop d2 or knight d2. Black always has c5. So white instead said, okay, I'm gonna go after him immediately with rook c1. But then Jan Magnus says c5 anyway, because I don't mind trading here like this and taking this pawn, because there is absolutely no advantage to white in this position, and it's a completely level position. So Jan tried to complicate with e5, because if d takes e5, then at least he has dc5, and that creates some sort of an imbalance in the position. This guy is a passed pawn. So even though the engines may say, oh, it's an equal position, from a human perspective, this is a pleasant advantage to have in the position. So Magnus is not going to allow that. So Magnus played queen to f5, saying you can take here if you want, but if you do that, then I first play c4, hit your queen. Once it drops back, I'm not trading, I'm just going to sit here, and now your pawn here on d4 is isolated. That guy is falling, and my pawn on c4 really creates some problems for you in the position. So this would be pleasant for black. So e takes d6 is not on, but then if you don't, then black is ready to play c4 himself. So dc was played. And now d takes c5, and Jan saw nothing better than bishop takes c5. Magnus took it because he wanted to trade as many pieces as he could, and I guess he was satisfied with the draw himself. Because if, let's say, knight takes e5, then white can avoid a piece trade with knight d4, and the game drags on for a little bit more. But with bishop takes e5, it is pretty obvious that the pieces are coming off, because rook takes and knight takes, and now he has to trade one more piece, because let's say he tries to save his knight, then I'd have to check anyway, and this rook falls. So he takes, and then rook takes, and Jan's had enough. I guess he didn't see any way for white to press in this position, so rook takes, and pretty much offers a draw with queen c3. Magnus takes the queen and says, okay, let's, for the sake of the audience, let's play out the draw, and play rook c8. And Jan played rook a5, attacking this pawn in return. I guess the point here is if rook b1, then black can play rook c5 and defend the pawn, and then you're not trading the pawns that you want to trade. Obviously, this is also drawn, but it's far more simpler to just trade pawns this way, because now if rook c5, then c4, and you're forcing the pawn trade, because if bc4 is impossible because of rook takes rook, and rook c4, rook b5, and it's traded off. And if black defends like this, then it's a passive defense, and white can even play actively rook a7. So rook a5 instead of rook b1, and Magnus takes, and now the players are making the rest of the moves as a formality. Just get a nice symmetrical looking position like this, make a few rook moves, get to time control 40 moves, and then on the 41st move, rook a7 was played and the game was drawn. So I think a satisfactory result for both sides, because Jan wanted to recover after game 6, and Magnus probably also wanted an easy game after the game that really dragged for hours and hours, the longest game in chess world championship history. So now that the players have a rest day, we'll see how the match shapes up now that Jan is down a point. So I expect some more interesting openings from Nepo, and I expect him to take more risks, and I think that will make the match even more lively. So looking forward to that.